I'm Laura Mogul, the Executive Director of Landmark on Main Street, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this joint production of Landmark and the Kowneck Peninsula Historical Society. I want to give a big shout out and thank you to our host and presenter for tonight and all of these programs, Chris Bain, and to Ann Latner, also from Kowneck Peninsula Historic Society. Together, they, with Landmark, have put together this really great series of walks through the history of our town. This is the next to last one. The last one will be in July. Chris will probably tell you a little bit more about his plans for future presentations in a little bit. We know we'll get to some questions tonight, and we know we won't get to all of them. So please do post your questions in the chat. And Chris has promised to go through all the questions and answer the ones he can and post a Q&A on the Historical Society's website afterwards. If you have any questions, any comments on this program, you can reach Landmark at info@landmarkonmainstreet.org or Chris at kowneck.org. And I'm sure he'll be giving you those website addresses again. Chris has a lot of material to cover tonight, so I'm going to turn the program over to Chris right now. Chris?
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank all the good people at the Landmark on Main Street for helping us with these presentations. I'd also like to thank the major support that the Historical Society gets from the Robert D. L. Gardner Foundation, the Peter and Jerry DeJana Foundation, James and Carly Hagedorn, the Ullman family, the Mertz Committee at the Community Chest of Port Washington, and all of our other supporters, large and small. Your support of our town's Historical Society is truly appreciated and never taken for granted. If you missed any of my earlier Zoom presentations, you can find them all on our website. That's kowneck.org under the Events tab. Once I started assembling the content for Sands Point, I quickly realized that there was far too much to cover in 45 to 50 minutes. So I'll touch on many of the major estates, some of the well-known people, as well as some of the lesser known, and of course, some juicy gossip. And know that we'll be skipping back and forth in time. Sands Point has far more content than I can possibly cover, so please accept my apologies if I've left out any of your cherished subjects. First, let's take a look at a map from 1906 for a point of reference, since I'll come back to that map several times so that you know where in Sands Point many of our subjects are located. Obviously, the yellow road up the middle is Middle Neck Road, which used to be Sands Point Road, heading all the way out to the end of our peninsula. You are probably all familiar with the large and gated wall at the end, which then takes a hard left turn and circles back to Middle Neck Road out here. And it's always instructive to point out the 6 named points of our peninsula, since I'll be referencing them several times tonight. Here is where the town dock will be built. Remember, this is 1906. Town dock came in around 1908 or 1910. But then we have Tom's Point, Plum Point, Barker's Point, Sands Point, Prospect Point, and Mott's Point. And there may be a quiz at the end of the evening, so pay attention. We'll start with a tour of the Sands Point Light, built in 1809 by Captain Noah Mason, who hailed from New London, Connecticut, and it was built at a cost of $8,500. This image shows the front of an annual calendar published by Lewis Oil Company, which they did every year for several decades. We have several of these wonderful little calendars. And of course, if any of you have these tucked away at home, please consider donating them to the Historical Society. We can always be found at kowneck.org. Here's my favorite hand-colored postcard of the lighthouse and the keeper's house. Noah Mason's gravestone is at the Sands Family Cemetery, noting that he was, quote, a soldier in the Revolutionary struggle, end quote. Here's an old Kodachrome that I shot about 1985 when the property was owned by Hagen and Jane Bayless. Later, it was sold to the present owners, who built a fabulous castle on their own property. And to their eternal credit, they also fully restored the lighthouse. And in 2015, it was recognized by the village's Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission. In 1924, this headline announced that Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont was buying the lighthouse from the federal government. But who was Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont? Well, first, she was born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, shown here at different stages in her illustrious life. In 1875, Alva married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America. Alva divorced Vanderbilt in 1895 at a time when divorce was rare amongst the elite. She received a large financial settlement reported to be in excess of $10 million, which is equal to $310 million today. The grounds for divorce were allegations of Vanderbilt's adultery. The next year, Alva remarried one of their old family friends, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, another fabulously wealthy guy, though he died 12 years later at the tender age of 49. However, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont didn't just marry well twice. She was a far more important person to history than either of her wealthy husbands. Alva and her millions was a huge supporter of the right for women to vote, known, of course, as the suffrage movement. If you are on our mailing list, then you may recognize this informational panel, since earlier in the year, we rolled out similar panels on many local women and a few men who were movers and shakers in this critical, important movement. Please take a look at these panels on our website under Local History, Local Suffragists. Alva had her mansion in New York City and another in Newport, of course, plus a few others. But in 1917, she built Beacon Towers at the tip of Sands Point. Here's the map. So I've outlined in red so you can see where everything is tonight. The house was on the right side of the point, facing northeast into Long Island Sound. Designed by Hunt and Hunt, it has often been described as pure Gothic fantasy, with 60 rooms and 60 primary rooms, I should say, and upwards of 140 rooms in total. Here's a nice aerial that shows it overlooking the beach and the sound, with the lighthouse and the keeper's house in the foreground. However, by 1927, Alva was living in Paris in order to be closer to her daughter, and Beacon Towers was sold to William Randolph Hearst. It was demolished in 1945, and the property was developed into about 7 building plots. Of course, you can still see Alva's wall and the gates and a few other interesting structures, like those ones with crosses, out at the very end of Middle Neck Road. Almost 70 years before Alva built her castle, and on that exact same spot, the Sands Point Hotel was built in 1850. Here's a poster from those days, advertising all the fun that you could have. It was built by B.B. Nostran, a local contractor, with 80 to 100 rooms, and was tremendously successful for more than 4 decades. This is from another Christmas and New Year card from Lewis Coal and Oil Company, which mentions the sidewheel steamers which arrived each day, bringing passengers from New York City, specifically naming the Croton and the Mayflower. One not mentioned was the Sewanaka, which was another popular steamer in the 1880s. This illustration from our archives, which says off Sands Point, was part of their June 1880 timetable. After your stay at the hotel for a few days or a week, the return trip would have the Sewanaka leave Roslyn at 6:45 a.m., Glenwood at 6:55, Seacliff at 7:15, Glen Cove at 7:25, and then pick up passengers at Sands Point at 7:45 a.m., then making stops at Great Neck and Whitestone en route to Manhattan. Unfortunately for the Sewanaka and many of its passengers, it had just left New York City on June 28, 1880, the same year as this timetable. It was a Monday, when an explosion aboard ship just outside of an area called Hell's Gate ended up in a disaster, taking more than 50 lives. So this specific timetable from our collection was probably the last one published for the good ship Sewanaka. We'll move south on Middle Neck Road and skip forward to the 1920s to meet Betty Fleischman. She was the daughter of Charles Lewis Fleischman, a food manufacturer and founder of the Fleischman Yeast Company. His commercially produced yeast allowed bread to be mass-produced, changing baking forever. With her inherited wealth, Betty Fleischman built the Chimneys about 1929, after the death of her husband, C.R. Holmes, who had been the dean of the medical school at the University of Cincinnati. Now here's a map showing the location, which was reportedly requiring 17 separate purchases of property in the area to amass the final 40 acres. Here's another beautiful view of the house, making it quite obvious why it was called the Chimneys. And finally, a much more recent view of the community synagogue, which purchased the home in 1954 and has been thriving ever since. Which brings us to the various lives of a 200-acre estate. First, we'll locate this property on our map. Howard Gould was the son of Jay Gould, a controversial robber baron who made zillions speculating in railroads. Howard's lasting impact on Sands Point are the castle-like buildings that remain to this day at the Sands Point Preserve Conservancy. I bet most of you have visited the preserve, as it's commonly known, but if you haven't been there in a few years, I urge you to do so. They've transformed the landscaping and the paths to an amazing degree, and you can wander around for hours with lots to see, or bring a picnic to enjoy in the grounds, and you can bring your dog on a leash. In 1898, Gould married an actress, Catherine Clemens, who was performing in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. One of the stops on their European honeymoon was Ireland, which was where the inspiration for the castles came from. Gould bought the undeveloped property in Sands Point in 1901, hired Hunt and Hunt to design and build castles just like those that he'd seen in Kilkenny, Ireland. This took years. And in the meantime, the marriage faltered. And in 1907, Mrs. Gould filed for divorce. It all played out in the New York Times and other New York papers. Although there were hundreds of lurid stories, I'll share just a few of the more interesting headlines. Gould won't pay wife's jewel bills. She took the cows from Castle Gould. I can't say that without laughing. She took the cows, had them trucked down to Virginia, and this is in 1907. Was starved out, says Mrs. Gould. Wife drank heavily, says Howard Gould. So this went back and forth for months, thousands of column inches in the papers. So these are the marital woes. You get the picture. And I did promise you some gossip. The divorce stretched on and on, gobbling up column inches in not only the New York Times, but the tabloids as well. The divorce was finalized in 1909, and although Gould continued to finish the buildings on the property, he never really lived there. And in 1917, he moved to Europe, sold the 220 acres, complete with the castles, and the letter G still emblazoned on the front gate. G for Gould, and now it would be G for Daniel Guggenheim. Daniel Guggenheim had 3 children, as you probably know. One of them was Harry, who we'll talk about. He assumed control of the family business upon the death of his father in 1905. The family fortune at that point was $300 million. He did live at Hempstead House, and he died there in 1930. So Daniel renamed Castle Gould Hempstead House, and he led an illustrious life. But since we have a lot of Guggenheims and others to get to, we'll move on to Daniel's son, Harry Guggenheim. He was the sponsor of early aviation, including Charles Lindbergh, who came to the house and the property frequently. He served in World War I in the Navy Reserve. He built Falaise in 1923 on 90 acres. He co-founded Newsday with his third wife, Alicia Patterson, though she really ran the paper. And he lived and died at Falaise, which is open to the public. If you guys have not toured Falaise yet, as soon as they allow tours again, you really should check this place out. It's an absolute, it's left the way Harry left when he died. And it's a beautiful, beautiful house. It's a great tour. Since we're going to quickly cover 2 more Guggenheims, let's see who came to Sands Point and in what order. William Guggenheim came first in 1900, then Isaac, Daniel, Solomon, and Harry, of course, was Daniel's son. 3 of these, the top 4 topping this list, purchased large properties in Sands Point, each about 200 acres. To make it a bit easier, we'll again turn to our map, to which I've added dates. So this was William's property up here. This was Daniel's and his son Harry. And this is Isaac, who we'll talk about, and Solomon. And we'll talk about each of these. In fact, let's go ahead and talk about Isaac. Isaac Guggenheim. It's his estate with its many incarnations. He bought it about 1906, what was probably one of the early Mott properties, shown in this painting from 1869, which appears in color on the cover of Joan Kent's wonderfully informative book, Discovering Sands Point. This familiar view is not too dissimilar from the same view today, other than that dirt road and the second story on the entry lodge. If you were to go through that gate back in the day and look to your left, you'd see this rare view of the gate lodge, which you would have to pass entering the property. Further into the property, you'd reach a 1,400-foot driveway bordered by locust trees. At some point, the driveway was dug up and grass was planted, all leading to Villa Corolla, also known as Corolla Farm, which looked just like this in 1953 when IBM purchased it to use it as a corporate retreat for their New York area employees. And it still looks just as good now that the Village Club of Sands Point has the property. They took it over in 1994. Here's a panoramic photo I made of what is probably the toughest drive on their 18-hole course over a gully that probably has more than 10,000 golf balls in it. Continuing south on the east side of the peninsula, we've reached the property of U.S. Congressman William Burke Cochran, who served 7 terms representing the east side of Manhattan in the U.S. Congress. Shown again on our map, he purchased these 300 acres of farmland, formerly owned by the Dodge family, about 1900. Here's a postcard of the home that he built and used as his summer residence, which he named the Cedars. This beautiful photograph shows some of the expansive barns and outbuildings. Sometimes I have to remind myself that this is Port Washington about 120 years ago and not some farmland upstate or in Pennsylvania. He was a devout Catholic, born in Ireland, and Cochran donated several acres comprising a small corner of his property and paid for the building of St. Peter's of Alcantara Church. The Cedars burned down in the 50s, I believe. However, some barns and outbuildings still exist, including this gatehouse, still sitting on Middle Neck Road. This has been some of the barns and this gatehouse have been restored and kept by their respective owners. These owners earned a very informative and distinctive plaque from Sands Point's Historic Landmark Preservation Commission. Here is the plaque for the barns, awarded in 2014, which can be read in full on our website. Prospect Point is worthy of a few minutes for several reasons. Of course, there was a beautiful mansion on the point, built in 1902 by architects whose identity has long been forgotten, though clearly not McKim, Mead, and White, as a former owner used to claim. Take a quick look at this map to see where we are again.
Stand up one second. I was just listening to something.
So take a quick look at this map to see where we are. This shows the property is owned by Alfred G. McDonald, who was the attorney and counsel for the city of Brooklyn at the time. Now, growing up in the 60s and 70s in Port Washington, the property, which was called Land's End, was often referred to as the Gadsby House. I remember hearing this all the time. The long discredited story that was that F. Scott Fitzgerald used to attend lavish parties there, hosted by owner Herbert Baird Swope, publisher of the New York World. Swope did, in fact, throw lavish parties at Land's End, as this was the Roaring '20s, and most of Sands Point was probably throwing lavish parties. However, Swope didn't buy the 15-acre place until 1928, and The Great Gatsby was published 3 years earlier in 1925. It's possible that Fitzgerald visited the former owner while he was writing Gatsby, a family named Sloan of Sloan's Beach Road, but there aren't any stories of Sloan's parties that I've come across. Well, here's the wild couple themselves. When The Great Gatsby came out, it received only mildly warm reviews, but did not sell well until many years later. In 1940, Fitzgerald died, reportedly believing that he was a failure and that his work would be forgotten. Now it's considered a literary masterpiece. By 1930, Zelda ended up in several psychiatric clinics, having been diagnosed as a schizophrenic. This map shows the Great Neck Peninsula, which was supposedly West Egg in the Gatsby book, and Port Washington Peninsula on the right, supposedly East Egg in Gatsby. In all probability, Scott and Zelda attended dozens and dozens of parties in Sands Point and Kings Point after the success of his earlier two novels. This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and the Damned both propelled Scott and Zelda into New York's high society. In all likelihood, the spectacular homes of Jay Gatsby and Daisy Buchanan were an amalgam of the various estates that they partied at, and not one specific mansion or another. Still, real estate agents to this day claim Gatsby connections whenever a major mansion comes up for sale. Now, before the demolition of Land's End, before the demolition was scheduled to take place, I was granted access to photograph the interior for 2 hours on behalf of the Historical Society. And note the two chimneys. There's another one on the right that you can't see behind the trees. This is a shot from a spring 2011 issue of Newsday. It shows the end of the demolition. Now you see this little rounded window up here. Let's go inside a year and a half earlier and look out. I wish I could have saved this one little window. There was even a little rowboat outside to frame in a window pane. I think the areas of marshland seen out of this window is protected from development, but I'm not sure. I do remember Marcia Foreman once telling me that she and a group of concerned friends had worked tirelessly toward protecting this area. I had expected Land's End to be in much worse shape. It really wasn't too bad. In the left shot, the front door is just to the right, And in the right shot, it's a second floor hallway. Here are two ground floor rooms, the right one still having the hand-painted wallpaper featuring cranes and other shorebirds. There was a similar window at the opposite end of the house. And if you want to see the rest of the shots that I took that day, you can find them on my website at chrisbain.com. A panoramic, and then we'll leave Prospect Point. In 2005, the last person to live in the house was Virginia Kraft Payson. When she finally had a serious buyer, she thought he was going to live in the house and restore it, not knock it down and subdivide the property. If you want to read a scathing quote from her, look up Herbert Baird Swope in Wikipedia, and then scroll down to the section titled Mansion. Mrs. Payson pulled no punches. So much for Prospect Point. Now we come to the Adam Mott House. So we've hopped down the coastline to see that house after 1895, when it became the home of Alfred Valentine Fraser and his bride, Martha Willits Mott. Martha Willits Mott, correct. On the left, you are looking at the Adam Mott House as seen in our 1982 publication, The Sketchbook of Historic Homes on Cow Neck. On the right, you see the Fraser homestead about 1905. Comparing the two, we see the two chimneys on both, 4 windows on the left side, 4 windows on the left side, 2 doorways for both. It's definitely an exact match of the house. Fay Fraser was a trustee of our historical society when I got there, and she loaned us a family photo album, which gives us a rare glimpse into one family's life in Sands Point at the turn of the last century. So I'm going to share just a few of my favorite photographs from that album. Meet Alfred Valentine Fraser, holding up several prize ducks, as well as a flock of ducks in front of one of the barns. The Fraser family had come from England in the mid-1800s and was in the fur business. Alfred Valentine Fraser was known as Val, shown here with 2 children in a beautiful automobile. Interior shots in photo albums from the turn of the century are very rare. There's lots of little details, from the andirons to the things that are on the mantle. This was probably a small dining room. Here's Val sitting on the porch with Thomas Mott Fraser and Martha Fraser. This beautiful photograph shows how the property sloped down to where Hempstead Harbor meets Long Island Sound. They are bringing in the hay, which is a reminder that there was still a fair amount of farming on the peninsula in the early 1900s. Here's a last look at the sketch of the homestead, along with the well-researched text in our Sketchbook of Historic Homes. We still have original copies of this 1982 publication. And if you'd like one, just make a donation of any size this month on our website or by check, and I'll send you a copy. And more importantly, if you or a friend have a family photo album that shows any area of Port Washington in the past, I would love the opportunity to photograph your photographs. So drop me a note at chris@cowneck.org. Now we're going to jump around and just see a few individual shots of notable homes and estates. What you're seeing right there is the waterfront estate of Frank Hofstadt at the end of what is now Hofstadt Lane, as is this. I may have been muted for a few minutes. So just saying that Mr. Hofstadt, the owner of this house, was the president of the Pressed Steel Car Company and had 3 different postcards of his estate. Fred Hicks was a 4-term Republican congressman. This card's a bit funny because there's either a typo, which was crossed out, Or maybe the card was made by the former homeowner. And instead of printing a new card, Fred Hicks just had the original name crossed out, in effect, and his name added. Maybe he was just thrifty. But this magnificent house still stands on Barker's Point Road. Mrs. Albert G. McDonald. Isabel McDonald, she lived in Brooklyn. So this is a summer residence where she was well known for hosting a great many charitable events in the community. This was also Mrs. Albert G. McDonald's house. Though I'm thinking this was her earlier residence, since in another postcard, it is shown as Fleischman's residence, though this Fleischman was Max Fleischman, the brother of Betty Fleischman at the Chimneys, and another heir to the Fleischman fortune. By the way, this waterfront property and house is still standing tall on Middle Neck Road. The George Thayer residence, shown here from the end of the house, and this frontal house, really showing off the grandeur of the mansion. Thayer's driveway became the entrance to the Village Club in 1994. Landing was the name of the waterfront estate of William Butler Duncan, who ended up selling off his 35 acres to William Vincent Astor in 1922. Then 2 years later, Astor purchased another 310 acres that comprised the former Burke Cochran estate, who had passed away the year before. Astor hired a company to develop most of the property into roads, building lots, and such, creating Harbor Acres. About 10 years ago, I showed this photograph at a presentation at the Port Washington Library. An elderly man raised his hand and identified himself as the littlest kid in this photo with his sister and their dog, which was wonderful, of course. Unfortunately, I misplaced the piece of paper with his name. So if anyone has any leads as to their identity, please drop me a note. Here is the residence of Wilkinson DeForest Wright, Esquire, near Barker's Point, which he called Deep Haven. Charles N. Nelson. No idea who he was. I've looked around. Joan Kent's book has a Charles A. Nelson, but not a Charles N. Nelson. But there is a reference, so that I think he may have been present at the creation of the village when they formed the village of Sands Point by including Barker's Point and Mott's Point in 1910. These were my dear friends, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Carey Rumsey Jr. Charlie's mother was Mary Harriman, sister of Averil Harriman, part of the fabulously wealthy railroad family. Mary Harriman, Charlie's mother, had McKim, Mead, and White design and build an amazing waterfront home on Middle Neck Road, partially shown here from the water side. And this 14-bedroom home has recently been lovingly renovated, restored, and modernized, and the 5-acre property can be yours for about $14 million. Mrs. J.B. O'Donoghue. No idea who this is, though it does look like it looks a little bit like the Thayer house. Here's the aerial view of the Luckenbach estate, just before the preserve that Daniel Guggenheim and the Goulds owned. It's on the Mott's Point side of the peninsula. Edgar Luckenbach was a steamship magnate, and his mansion later became the Sands Point Country Day School, which was demolished in the 80s to make room for new homes. This 1934 admission tag shows that they had horse shows on the estate during the Depression to raise money for the Village Welfare Society of Port Washington. So here are a bunch of names. Those of you steeped in Sands Point history will recognize the name of James Laidlaw, the first mayor of Sands Point. This beautiful home can still be seen on Middle Neck Road. Harriet Burton Laidlaw and her husband James were movers and shakers in the local suffragist movement. And you can read about them on our website. Again, it's Local History, Local Suffragists. Their daughter, Louise Laidlaw, she married Dana Backus. Dana Backus donated the 17th century Dutch barn to the Kauneck Peninsula Historical Society when he was planning to divide up his property. The barn had originally been built about 1690 by the Sands family. It was taken apart and reassembled on a new foundation at the Sands Willis House. We recently undertook a major renovation and are planning on converting it to an exhibition space, housing more of our collection. John Philip Seuss's house. It was built on a bluff between Barker's Point and Plum Point, overlooking Manhasset Bay. He named it Wild Bank, a nod to his preference for a wild state of the bluff, which leads down to the water. Quite a beautiful house. It's a National Historic Landmark, obviously, and Sousa lived there from 1915 until his death in 1932. I toured it recently, and it's in gorgeous condition. Westover, a house I had not heard about 3 months ago, but it was built on the highest hilltop in Sands Point. And this was the summer home of Mariana Wright Chapman, another major force in the women's suffrage movement. Here's our map showing this house's location. And amazingly, the house is still there with its signature blue tiled roof, reportedly visible to pilots landing at LaGuardia. A few of us toured the house several weeks ago, and it's truly magnificent. And here's the older view from the water side. Now, John and Mary Cornwall were probably the first to settle and build a house on Kauneck in 1676, though the peninsula was already occupied by more than 300 cows, happily grazing away. This map shows you roughly where their property was, which had been granted to them by the British governor, Edmund Andros. I don't have time here to tell you about the battle between the Cornwalls and the owners of the grazing cattle, but suffice it to say, the Cornwalls' legal rights were upheld and their farm grew and prospered, shown here in the late 1800s. Their house grew as well, most notably in the mid-1800s, and it's shown here in a 1950 sales brochure. This stone arch over the driveway was built by Susan Cornwall in 1890 and inscribed Cornwalton. And amazingly, the arch is still there, as is the house, welcoming visitors to the homestead. Now, Wampage Shores was probably one of the most ambitious developments in Sands Point, and it started around 1910 or so. As you can see from our map, it included Plum Point and just butted up against Manor Haven. This postcard shows the land cleared for development. You can sort of make out Plum Point there, and even possibly a barge bringing sand from Port Washington to Manhattan, but that's a story for another day. Samuel Osgood Pell, a successful real estate broker in Sands Point, had an office in the city and owned the property. He must have spent a bunch of money advertising these building lots, and not just in the New York City papers. This shows the cover and the first page of a lavish 28-page color booklet on really good paper, which Pell had commissioned and printed, touting all the wonderful aspects of home ownership at Wampage Shores. Most of it was true. And on the left, besides Plum Point, you can make out the building lot sort of in a semicircle. Going through here, these little lines just sort of show you where the building lots were. And you can make out a little dock here, some sailboats, and some kind of building with maybe an orange roof. This is exactly what you see over here on the right. So you turn the page, open the brochure, and you've entered the wondrous life available to you at Wampage Shores. Here are two more pages extolling the wonders of motoring and yachting on Long Island. There are many more pages like this, and I don't have the time to show them to you tonight, but both the prose and the artwork is outstanding and compelling. But wait, there's more. Included in the brochure were folded inserts showing the actual building lots and the cost of ownership. If you were interested in the waterfront lot number 60, like right here, here's the bay, Manhasset Bay, you had a price list that came with this. And lot number 60 could be yours in 1911 for just $7,500, which is about $210,000 today. Of course, on top of that would be the cost of building your dream home. Sadly, Osgood Pell didn't live long enough to reap all the benefits of this beautiful 1911 brochure, because 2 years later in 1913, his car was crossing over some Long Island Railroad tracks and was crushed by a train. The tip of Plum Point remained in the Pell family for several decades and was soon to have a very happy chapter. The Sands Point Bath Club, Sands Point Bath and Tennis Club, Sands Point Bath and Racket Club, and I even saw a listing for the Sands Point Casino. I do remember Charlie and Mary Rumsey talking fondly about partying there in the late 40s, and they always just called it the club. And considering there was at least 60 years of partying, swimming, sailing, tennis, and more, one would think there'd be lots and lots of photos to pick from. Alas, I have run across very few. So if anyone out there is sitting on a small collection of related images, please let me know. Suffice it to say, in its two heydays, the 1920s and the late 1940s, Saturday nights were often formal, even black tie affairs, with Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey's band playing to an appreciative post-World War II crowd. Celebrity spotting was also a pastime. And right here, we have Glenn Miller right here. That's the man. Now, this 1941 charge account receipt, just 6 months before Pearl Harbor, shows 2 dinners for $4, 1 old-fashioned for 55 cents, 1 pony of brandy for $1.25, and 1 black label scotch for 55 cents, for a whopping total of $6.35. Suffice it to say, this place was a legend, and many considered it the place to be through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. However, an all-encompassing fire in 1986 brought those days to an end. Left behind were these bath cabins, empty and falling apart when I found them a year or so later. Same with an empty swimming pool. No worries though, since someone purchased this truly one-of-a-kind spot and built a magnificent home for their family. As I've been saying, Sands Point is too big a topic to cover in one short presentation, so I'm saving the sporting diversions for another time. We'll close with a 1901 photograph of John Whitmer Jr. relaxing on Middle Neck Road, then called Sands Point Road, looking north at the junction, and to the right is the just purchased Howard Gould property, where stories were soon to be created. I'd be very happy to answer any questions. So Laura, I will pass it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We've had a lot of comments, people answering each other's questions. There was a question about when you were, I think, out on the point there at the bath club. Somebody asked if that one of the pictures you showed was the Zausner's house.
I do not know of the Zausner's house. Could be though.
Could be. And somebody else said it looked like it was, and that was, I guess, the bath club. Somebody was supposed to be married there, but it burned down a month before. Couple of questions. You mentioned Glenn Miller. There's also persistent talk of a famous resident, famous singer resident of Port Washington.
Oh, Perry Como
Perry
would have sung
Como.
there often.
Yeah, where was his home?
It's either on Messenger Lane or West Creek Farms Road. I think it was Messenger Lane, or it could have been. I'm pretty sure it was one of those two. I passed that about a week ago. I remember when I was in high school, a girl in my class, Julie Scheinman, had the house, and we used to go out there a couple times in the summer, one summer, and swim in the pool.
Yep, somebody just said Cornwell's Beach
Cornwall's
Road.
Beach Road. There you go. That's the
And
third road that
Walter
I couldn't remember.
Black's family bought it. So
There you go.
Chris, someone is asking why Land's End was torn down and not landmarked.
Landmarking is a process done only by the owner. And if the owner doesn't want to landmark something, then it doesn't get landmarked. It's a very long process. You start with the state of New York, and that house probably could have been landmarked. If there's been a certain amount of change to it, if you put in, fancy lighting systems or roof ducts or things, then you can't, it might not be landmarked. The Plandome Mill couldn't get landmarked. We tried to help them with that, but there have been a few changes. But the owner, Mrs. Payson, didn't want to go through that. She just wanted to sell it. At one point, it was on the market for $50 million, which was a little crazy. But, and then when the developer bought it, it was just a matter of time, because I'm pretty sure he wanted to put up what he wanted to put up was a bunch of houses, and most of them aren't built yet. You can drive down there yourself.
I heard, if you don't mind me interjecting,
Sure.
back when they tore it down, because that was just down the road from our house. And I went back in 2011 to show my daughter. We were on a trip to New York. I live out west. That the developer had promised that he was going to keep the house and, renovate it to its original. And apparently he lied to, there's a woman who I knew on Facebook from Port Washington and Roslyn who was aware of this, said they wanted to get it in the historical register, but he promised that he was going to do what he did, and he ended up subdividing the lot and building like 3 or 4 $6 million homes at the time. So whoever that developer was, I don't know. I guess you would know better than I would. It was
His name was Bert Brodsky.
Yeah, and my friend Greta, she passed away last year suddenly, so she had filled me in on that. She was like my brother's age, and she was the one that told me on Facebook about what had happened, because I was in shock, because my dad was friends with, there was a carriage house at the entrance to that.
Yes, yeah, I've got pictures of that on my site.
Yeah, well, the people that lived in there was the granddaughter, Swope, his granddaughter, and her, I don't know if it was her husband, but my dad and him used to go sailing together. And so I was all excited to show my daughter, who was only at the time, I think she was like 18, when I took her, 19 years old. She had never been there, never seen my home. And I was really disappointed. I was really like, oh my God, I can't believe they tore down this place. Because I kind of kept, yeah, it was a fascinating place.
It was. And I think Chris's pictures on his website.
I saw that.
They're magnificent. And
oh, they were.
We could spend a whole night on that, but I have a lot of other questions flying in now. Don, thank you for your comments and your recollections. Somebody asked about the Navy in Sands Point.
Yes.
Yeah.
When
and can I ask that if you're not actually asking a question, that you mute yourselves, please? Thanks.
Sure.
So Chris, the Navy in Sands Point?
Yeah, when World War II broke out, the most of the property was, I'm not sure what the legal term was, but it was sort of given for use by the U.S. government, and the U.S. government had a couple different things. The first thing they did was they painted all the woodwork gray in all the buildings, which was crazy, of course. If you've been in Hempstead House now, I can't imagine what they had to do to get rid of that gray paint. But when I was a kid, I was about 8 or 10 years old, living up in Montfort Hills, and a friend's dad had been in the Navy. He took us out there. I don't know if it was Memorial Day or the 4th of July or something, but at that point it was a special weapons testing something or other. And they had it, and it was used, it was also a place that they commanded sort of the home guard and the volunteers around town for when they would have blackouts during World War II. I think that was sort of manned and planned out there.
Wow. Nice place for barracks. Peter Foreman, you have a question.
Just a second.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
That was called the Special Devices Center, and my husband said that there were link trainers in it for the Navy.
Really? Really?
Yes.
That's great. Those are the early trainers.
That kids could use as well.
Kind of like Safety Town today down at Nassau at Eisenhower. Peter, what was your question?
Hi, Chris. Great presentation. So in Sands Point, there's one street is Cornwall Beach Lane, and the other one is Cornwall Road. Any clue whether those were related or not?
Well, they were all part of the Cornwall property at the time. They had quite a bit of property, but it was in dispute originally because they had gotten it from the British governor, and then some of the people that had cows that were grazing all over Cow Neck were outraged that someone started to build a house, and they got together and went and tore down his house one night when they were away. And then he took them to court, and the Cornwalls won, and the guys had to build the house back. It wasn't a huge house at the time. It was the beginning. Like at our Sands Willets house, the Sands portion is a small old part of the house. But it was all part of their property, and names did change as property was subdivided quite often. Astor Lane next to the Village Club now has had at least 3 different names. And of course, Main Street in town was Flower Hill Avenue. So that they changed fairly often in Sands Point as well.
So even though they're spelled differently, Cornwell and Cornwall, you think it's the same family?
I've seen 3 different spellings, and Joan Kent mentions 3 different spellings in her book: Cornwall with an A, Cornwell with an E, and Cornell, Cornel. And you got to remember, sometimes they signed them that way because not everyone could write and not everyone could read. So you had, and in some cases on old documents, I've seen where they just had to make their mark, and then someone else had to sort of identify, well, that was Peter Foreman or something else,
Right. Well, Peter Foreman, actually, you need to do a little brushing up on your Sands Point history, since you're now running for mayor of Sands Point.
That's right. That's right.
And yeah, so all of this history, we'll be asking you the questions next. There was one more question here, and then I think we're going to let Chris go because it's almost 9 o'clock, and you can keep submitting questions to Chris at chris@cowneck.org. But I have another question here. On which property was the old house on Old House Lane? Said, my brother lived there with the Gruskins, who owned the house in the 1980s. It faced Hempstead Harbor. Is that house still there, as far as you know?
I do not know the answer to that. That 1906 map is one of the best ones because it has so many names on it. We've got maps from the 20s and maps from the late 1800s, and they often have people's names on them. So I would have to look at those. I'm not familiar with that house specifically, or which was the oldest house on Old House Lane. But I would turn to the maps first.
Right. So as I said before, if you will go through the chat, we'll find the questions that were asked, and we will, Chris will be doing some research. The video of this presentation will be edited and put up on Landmark's YouTube channel, and also accessible on the Cowneck Peninsula Historical Society's website. So we've greatly enjoyed it, Chris. It's just fascinating to see how much history is still with us here in Sands Point. They're beautiful old properties, and it's really wonderful to see them.
Well, I just scratched the surface on everything. Most of those subjects you could do an evening on. especially when you are using Joan Kent's book, which I am I'm floored by the amount of detail in that. It is such a great book, and there is so much material in there. I probably turn the pages 50 times a day for the last 2 months. So it's really great. But there is you could do stuff on the Guggenheims or any of the major houses. So it's fun research.
Right. Well, I think we're going to wrap this up for tonight. We're leaving Chris with plenty of homework. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to Chris Bain and to Ann Latner from Kaunak Peninsula Historical Society. Thank you to everybody who helped support both Landmark and the Kaunak Peninsula Historical Society. We live in a historic building. Actually, the Landmark building is on the National Register of Historic Places, was the subject of one of Chris's earlier programs. And so we all know that history is always with us, and it's one of the great things about Port Washington. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Chris. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank everybody.